I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. When people hear the word addiction, they think of alcohol, tobacco, or opioids. But can we be addicted to shopping or fast food? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Dr. Robert Lustig, professor of pediatrics at the University of California, San Francisco, says big companies are using the science of pleasure to make money, but it isn't good for us.
We are getting fat, sick, stupid, broke, addicted, depressed, and most decidedly, unhappy. We can turn it around, but we have to turn it around at a societal level.
Find out why the difference between pleasure and happiness is vitally important to our national well-being.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Lustig on the hacking of the American mind.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, researchers announced promising new results from immunotherapy against B-cell lymphoma. 2 new studies presented at the annual meeting of the American Society of Hematology reported that CAR T therapy achieved impressive results for 40% of patients. CAR T stands for chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy. Patients donate blood so that their white blood cells, known as T cells, can be taught to recognize and attack their cancer cells. This week, scientists reported on 2 such therapies, Yescarta and Kymriah. Each produced durable remissions that were dramatically better than conventional therapies. The cost, however, is close to $400,000.
The high cost of medication can affect patient access. Over the last 10 years, the price of insulin has tripled in the U.S. This is a life-saving medication for people with type 1 diabetes. A small survey of almost 200 patients who need insulin found that a quarter of them had reduced their doses in order to save money. People reported using less insulin than prescribed, stretching out the insulin, or not filling an insulin prescription because of cost. Not surprisingly, those who reported skimping were less likely to be controlling their blood sugar adequately. As a result, they may experience negative health consequences. A related commentary in JAMA Internal Medicine notes that the cost of insulin in other countries is substantially lower than in the U.S. People who couldn't afford their insulin have died.
Lyme disease can sometimes be hard to treat because the bacteria that causes it, Borrelia burgdorferi, can go dormant. When it's not actively reproducing, antibiotics can't kill it. But a scientist at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health has found 10 different essential oils from plants that are lethal to the bacteria even while it's growing slowly. Compounds from garlic, allspice, spiked ginger lily blossoms, myrrh trees, and Mei Chang fruit killed stationary phase Lyme bacteria in the culture dish within a week. Other plant compounds that killed the bacteria came from cumin seeds, thyme leaves, and cinnamon bark. This research is still very preliminary. The next step will be to test some of these potent natural compounds against Lyme infections in laboratory animals. Ultimately, scientists will need to do clinical trials in infected humans.
Many personal care products, such as soaps, shampoos, deodorants, perfumes, and cosmetics contain endocrine-disrupting chemicals. These include phthalates, parabens, and phenols such as triclosan, which is used as an antibacterial ingredient in toothpaste and soap. A new study published in the journal Human Reproduction tracked more than 300 children from before birth through adolescence. The scientists measured levels of phenols, phthalates, and parabens in mothers' urine during pregnancy. They analyzed the children's urine and hormonal development between the ages of 9 and 13. Girls exposed to higher levels of these compounds prenatally entered puberty earlier. All of these chemicals are estrogen mimics, which probably explains why girls were strongly affected and boys were not.
Do people who often indulge in sugary soft drinks have a higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes? Canadian scientists reviewed the evidence from 155 studies that included more than 5,000 volunteers. The total amount of fructose in study diets did not seem to make a difference. Fruit, as part of a healthy diet, providing an appropriate amount of energy, actually seemed to be beneficial even though it's high in fructose. However, fructose from nutrient-poor sources such as soft drinks increased the chance that people would have high blood sugar, elevated HbA1c, and eventually proceed to type 2 diabetes. The investigators point out that overall the quality of the studies is low. They would like to see further research conducted as randomized controlled trials. That's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Have you ever tried to eat just one potato chip? It's a challenge. Food manufacturers have figured out ways to trick our taste buds into wanting more.
Our neurochemistry is sensitive to rewards. Just as rats will perform tasks for M&Ms, so will we humans do what it takes to get the pleasure we seek. Does that make us vulnerable to manipulation?
To better understand how food companies manipulate us, we turn to Dr. Robert Lustig. He's professor of pediatrics in the Division of Endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco. He's a member of the university's Institute for Health Policy Studies and author of Fat Chance, Beating the Odds Against Sugar, Processed Food, Obesity, and Disease. His latest book is The Hacking of the American Mind, the science behind the corporate takeover of our bodies and brains.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Robert Lustig.
Thanks very much for having me, Terry. Appreciate it.
Dr. Lustig, you're a pediatric endocrinologist, and in our previous conversation, you talked a lot about sugar. It's nearly ubiquitous in the American diet. It's caused a lot of damage. So it seems a bit of a leap to train your attention to the, quote, corporate takeover of our bodies and brains. That's the subtitle of your recent book, The Hacking of the American Mind. So what exactly do you mean by hacking the American mind? That sounds kind of scary.
Well, a little bit. And I think people should be somewhat scared. I went to MIT undergrad, and we were ground zero for hacking. We actually originated the word. I mean, aside from butchers. In 1955, the MIT Railroad Club used the word hack to denote a prank that was done with panache, with whimsy, with flair, with, a performance component, almost street art, if you will.
Can you give us some examples of hacking at MIT?
Sure, you bet. Like, for instance, a group of fraternity brothers dug a trench under the 40-yard line at Soldier Field and planted a weather balloon in the ground, and with 2 minutes to go in the first half of the Harvard-Yale game, this weather balloon popped out of the ground at the 40-yard line, and it said MIT all over it, and then exploded. I mean, that's a hack.
No, we get it.
All right. Or how about, stealing a police car is a felony offense, but stealing a Boston police car, taking it apart piece by piece, carrying each piece up 5 floors to the great dome of MIT, and then reassembling it and putting a mannequin of a policeman with a box of donuts in the front seat. Okay, that's a hack.
Yeah, that's a great
You get
hack.
the idea.
Yeah.
Okay, well, unfortunately, I wish hacking had stayed that way. Unfortunately, now we have what's known as black hat hacking. For instance, computer code. It made itself very known during the 2016 election, as you know. Now we know with Cambridge Analytica and all that's happened. The question is, does that have any lessons for us? Now, people would say, well, duh, brains are not computers. Well, actually, they sort of are. And you can introduce malicious code into a computer. Well, you can actually introduce malicious data into a brain. And you can change behavior. You can change what that person does. And it doesn't even take Cambridge Analytica. It can take your grandma.
Your grandma?
That's the point of the book. In fact, this all has to do with two neurotransmitters in the brain. One is called dopamine, and the other one's called serotonin. Now, dopamine has taken an outsized portion of our knowledge and our, ethos, if you will, because everybody recognizes dopamine as the pleasure or reward neurotransmitter. We now know that there is an area of the brain called the reward center. In Latin, it's called the nucleus accumbens. And when the neurotransmitter dopamine is released in that area of the brain, you experience reward. Now, that reward can take many different visages. It can be a substance, such as cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, sugar, or it can be a behavior, such as shopping, gambling, internet, video gaming, social media, pornography. Every single one of those things provides some level of reward. Well, it turns out that every one of those things also in the extreme leads to addiction. There's an aholic next to every single one of those. Now, serotonin, this other neurotransmitter, and you're maybe familiar with that as well, because 25% of America is now on SSRIs, that's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, in an attempt to try to boost serotonin levels in the brain. Serotonin is the contentment or the happiness neurotransmitter. So when you get a boost of serotonin, you feel better. Now, the point I make in the book is that we have these two neurotransmitters, and they are not the same. They have different mechanisms of action. They're made from different amino acids. They have different regulatory pathways. They both convey a positive emotion. In the case of dopamine, or pleasure, the positive emotion is, this feels good, I want more. In the case of serotonin, it's, this feels good, I don't want or need anymore. Now, clearly, these are not the same. The point is, because they're not the same, we should be cognizant of which one we are pursuing, but we are not. In fact, pleasure and happiness have come to mean virtually the exact same thing in our modern society. We now think we can buy happiness. Well, the fact is we can't. The reason we think this is because corporations, Madison Avenue, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, Washington, D.C., have confused and conflated these two terms, pleasure and happiness, so that you believe they are the same thing. And so you end up chasing pleasure with the thought that you're chasing happiness. Here's the problem. As dopamine goes up, serotonin goes down. So the more pleasure you seek, the more unhappy you get.
Dr. Lustig, you basically argue in The Hacking of the American Mind that a big part of our problem is that we confuse pleasure and happiness. And they do seem rather similar. I hope you can explain how they're different.
Sure. I can determine 7 differences between these two, and perhaps you can even come up with more. Number 1, pleasure is short-lived, like a meal. Happiness is long-lived, like a lifetime. Pleasure is visceral, that is, you feel it in your body. Happiness is ethereal, you feel it above the neck. Pleasure is taking, happiness is giving. Pleasure is experienced alone. Happiness is usually experienced in social groups. Pleasure can be achieved with substances. Happiness cannot be achieved with substances. The extremes of pleasures, whether it be substances or behaviors that we just talked about, in the extreme lead to addiction, and I can explain why. Whereas there's no such thing as being addicted to too much happiness. And finally, again, pleasure is dopamine, happiness is serotonin. So these 2 positive emotions could not be more different from each other. And here's the problem. Dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. In the brain, when it's released, it always excites the next neuron. Now, neurons like to be excited. That's why they have receptors in the first place. But neurons like to be tickled, not bludgeoned. Chronic overstimulation of any neuron anywhere in the brain will lead to neuronal cell death. And we know that because as a pediatrician, I take care of a lot of kids who are in status epilepticus, nonstop seizures, who end up in the intensive care unit. And the longer those seizures go, the more their brain they fry. And so it becomes impingent upon us to stop those seizures as quickly and as completely as possible in order to reduce brain damage. So anything that causes a cell to fire nonstop and indiscriminately will ultimately lead to neuronal cell death. Now, the cells receiving that dopamine signal, they know. So they have a plan B. They have a fail-safe, if you will. What they do is they downregulate their own receptor for dopamine in an attempt to try to reduce the chance that any given molecule will find a receptor, in an attempt to try to reduce the firing rate. So in human terms, what does this mean? Well, you get a hit, you get a rush, receptors go down. Next time, you need a bigger hit to get the same rush, and the receptors go down. And then a bigger hit, and a bigger hit, and a bigger hit, until finally you need a huge hit to get nothing. That's called tolerance. And then when the neurons actually start to die, that's called addiction. And the problem is that when those neurons die, they don't come back.
You're listening to Dr. Robert Lustig, professor of pediatrics in the Division of Endocrinology and a member of the Institute for Health Policy Studies at the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Lustig consults for several childhood obesity advocacy groups and government agencies. His most recent book is The Hacking of the American Mind, the science behind the corporate takeover of our bodies and brains.
We need to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll learn more about tolerance and addiction.
How do our schools and our governmental agencies enable corporations?
What is neuromarketing?
What are the effects of this approach to marketing products?
Most importantly, how can we break out of this vicious cycle?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you're enjoying this People's Pharmacy podcast, why not head over to our website where you'll find a wealth of information on medications, conditions, home remedies, and ways to keep yourself healthy. You'll find it all at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. If you would like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 1145. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can also find the show online at peoplespharmacy.com, or download the podcast from iTunes.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by BrainGauge, developed by neuroscientists at the University of North Carolina to track brain health. Home, research, and clinical applications available. Home subscription options are available online. GaugeYourBrain.com.
Today we're talking about the difference between pleasure and happiness. Big corporations have found ways to use pleasure to get us to do what they want. Will that make us happy?
We're talking with Dr. Robert Lustig, professor of pediatrics in the Division of Endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco. He's a member of the university's Institute for Health Policy Studies and author of Fat Chance, Beating the Odds Against Sugar, Processed Food, Obesity, and Disease. His latest book is The Hacking of the American Mind, the science behind the corporate takeover of our bodies and brains.
Dr. Lustig, you were just talking about tolerance and addiction and how they develop.
So basically, neurons downregulate their own receptors. And when they do that, you need more to get less. And that's this phenomenon we call tolerance. And when the neurons start to die, that's called addiction. And then those neurons do not come back very easily or at all. So addiction is extraordinarily difficult to treat, as you know. So this concept that overstimulation of the reward center ultimately leads to phenomena that are consistent and associated with addiction, this can happen with cocaine, this can happen with heroin, this can happen with nicotine, alcohol, and what we've learned most recently is it happens with sugar for the same reasons. Now, people say, wait a second, how can sugar be addictive? Sugar is a food. The question is it really? It actually is not. It's a food additive, just like caffeine. So caffeine's addictive. Now, nobody cares whether caffeine's addictive because it's not toxic. All right? In fact, if you take my Starbucks away from me, I will kill you. But the fact is, caffeine is addictive, not toxic. Well, sugar is addictive, but it's also toxic. Sugar does three things that other carbohydrates don't. Number one, drives liver fat production in the liver, which causes all the chronic metabolic diseases we know about, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, heart disease. Number two, it causes the aging reaction, the browning reaction, the Maillard reaction, the reason bananas brown, the reason you get wrinkles as you get older. Well, turns out sugar drives that reaction 7 times faster than starch. And then finally, number three, the sweet molecule in sugar, called fructose, is addictive because it stimulates this area of the brain, the nucleus accumbens. So if you have something that's both toxic and addictive, you've got a problem. And what we do is we have rehab and we also have laws. Well, for sugar, we have neither. So your grandma, hate to say it, is a pusher. And, you know, everyone is a pusher now, including schools, including the federal government, and certainly, of course, the food companies. Now, that's what food is doing. That's what drugs are doing. What about behaviors? What about things like Facebook? We now have people who are Facebook addicted or social media addicted or video gaming addicted. People say, how can that be an addiction? It's not a drug. Well, it turns out it does the exact same thing in the brain as all of these other substances of abuse. Causes the same downregulation, causes the same tolerance, and ultimately causes the same level of misery and depression.
Now, Dr. Lustig, you said schools and government, in essence, are enablers of all of this.
Absolutely.
Can you explain what you're talking about?
Well, for the schools, all you have to do is walk into the cafeteria or go to their bake sales. For government, just remember that $56 billion a year is from export tariffs on processed food. So they're making money allowing the processed food companies to deliver overseas. So they're in bed with the processed food industry in order to up the rates, up the profit. The problem is we're the ones suffering in the process, and it's going on all over the world. It's not just America. It's going on everywhere you look. And as I said earlier, when dopamine goes up, serotonin goes down. So we also have a depression crisis all over the world as well. There are now 4.4% of the entire world now carries a diagnosis of clinical depression, and that's an 18.5% increase in just one decade. So this is not an American phenomenon. This is a human phenomenon. And anywhere where they adopt the processed food diet and technology as the driver of shall we say, connectivity rather than connection, because we'll get to the difference in a minute, we see these exact same phenomena going on worldwide.
Dr. Lustig, you've written about neuromarketing. Can you tell us what that is and how it's connected to this phenomenon?
Sure. So everyone knows what marketing is, right? Not really. People think that marketing just means that people are selling you stuff on TV. Actually, marketing has a very different meaning. The definition of marketing is using information to espouse your point of view. What's the definition of propaganda? Using disinformation to espouse your point of view. So the difference between marketing and propaganda is the truth. The commonality is dopamine. Turns out, when you hear something you believe, you get a dopamine hit. If you hear something you don't believe, you don't get a dopamine hit. Now, it doesn't matter if that whatever it is that you believe is true or not. Irrelevant the veracity of the statement. If you believe it's true, your dopamine levels in your brain rise. We know this because Sam Harris, a famous neuroscientist from UCLA, also a podcaster and, written several books. He's known as one of the 4 horsemen of atheism. He took 15 devout religious zealots and 15 dyed-in-the-wool atheists and stuck them in a functional MRI scanner and read them specific messages that were specifically designed to either cause them to identify and empathize with that statement or not. And it turned out whenever he read something that was religious in nature to the religious zealots, they got the same dopamine hit they would have gotten from, say, a hit of cocaine. Whereas when he read an atheistic statement to an atheist, he got that same hit as well. So it doesn't matter what the statement is. If you believe it, that will drive reward. We kind of know that. Well, what's happened in neuromarketing is that because we now have computer algorithms to figure out who each person is based on their demographics, based on their appearance, based on their biochemical phenotype or genotype, based on their responses to questions that they answer, say, on Facebook, like "This is your digital life," which is what happened with Cambridge Analytica. You can now be targeted directly and specifically based on your mindset to receive messages that will give you a dopamine hit in order for companies or political campaigns to make you think what they want you to. That's neuromarketing.
Dr. Lustig, most of us like to think and value the perception of our own autonomy, that we can stop almost any behavior that we want to, whether it's eating ice cream or whether it's spending hours on a video game. We think, it's just willpower. And I think back to graduate school at the University of Michigan, and down in the basement, we had a monkey colony in the Department of Pharmacology. And these monkeys had backpacks, and they had opportunity to self-inject a variety of compounds, including cocaine. And when it came to cocaine, they could never stop. They just kept hitting that bar for another injection. And they would literally keep hitting that bar until they almost died, getting, as you have pointed out, that dopamine jolt. I'm wondering, if those monkeys couldn't stop, what about us? How do we stop?
That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point, Joe. That's the definition of addiction, isn't it? You know that whatever it is you're addicted to, whether it be a substance or a behavior, it is ruining your family, it is ruining your community, it is ruining your health, it's ruining your personal economy, it is ruining your society, and you are powerless to do anything about it. That's exactly the definition of addiction. So, hedonic substances or hedonic behaviors, and it doesn't matter which, these are addictive phenomena in the extreme. Now, it's true that not everyone gets addicted to every single thing. For instance, I was exposed to Demerol when I was 25 years old because I had a gastric ulcer. I did not become an opiate addict. Okay? There are 40% of the entire U.S. population who are teetotalers, and there are another 40% who are social drinkers where they can pick it up and then put it down and it's no problem. But that means there are 20% that are hardcore heavy drinkers, and of those 20%, 10% of those are actually dyed-in-the-wool, bona fide alcoholics who cannot stop and who require intervention. So the question is, if you know these things in your heart of hearts, if you know how bad these things are, if you know that you're going to get lung cancer if you don't stop smoking cigarettes, if you know that being an opiate addict is ultimately going to kill you, how come you keep doing it? Where's the willpower in addiction? There is no willpower. Ultimately, we actually know this because we can see it in the economics. Let's look at food as an example. There's an economic term that we use in the food business called price elasticity. And what this says is, if you raise the price of a certain item by 1%, how will it change consumption? So obviously, if the price goes up 1%, you would expect consumption to go down 1%. Well, that's if something is completely price elastic. But there are a lot of things that are price inelastic. That is, you raise the price and consumption keeps up, stays up. The most price inelastic item, fast food. When fast food goes up, people still consume it. And the second thing is soft drinks. Well, guess what? Both of those are sugar containing. And we know sugar is addictive because it does the same thing in the brain. The most price elastic item is eggs. So when eggs go up in price, people stop eating eggs. So you can actually see this phenomenon in economics. This isn't just a neuroscience issue. This is our society. This is how we either judge value or can't judge value. And the fact of the matter is, the more hedonic substances and or behaviors we are peddled, the more we gravitate to them, the sicker we become, the more money we spend, therefore the more money they make, and the more we devolve as a society. Well, here's what you need to know. The dopamine response curve is not linear. In other words, it's not like a little dopamine means a lot of reward. It's actually a bell-shaped curve. There's a place in the middle of that curve where you've reached your peak, where you are fun and you are focused and you are phenomenal. You are the friggin' life of the party. Okay? And that's where everybody wants to be, is right at the top of that bell-shaped curve. Now, if you're to the left of that curve, you are lethargic. You can't get off the couch to even change the channel. Never mind, go out and, mingle at a party. If you are to the right of that bell-shaped curve. You are irritable. You are angry. You are so annoyed. You know what? You can get so annoyed that you might just go out and vote. Or you might get so annoyed you just might go out, pick up a gun, and kill people. I think we have plenty of data, and we have actually MRI data to support the notion that what we are seeing across the United States is a shift of our dopamine curves to the right.
Dr. Lustig, how can we break out of this vicious cycle?
I thought you'd never ask. Well, we need to tamp down our dopamine. We need to up our serotonin. And we also need to tamp down on another area of the brain which we really haven't talked about, which is this area behind our forehead called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that keeps you from doing stupid things. In the book, I call it the Jiminy Cricket part of your brain. Okay? It's the part of your brain that is able to forecast in the future. You know, it's the part of your brain that's able to interpret consequences of your actions. It's the part of your brain that says, wait, I want to delay my gratification for a specific thing because the reward will be greater if I do that, if I engage in that delay. These are all things that we are now not doing because our prefrontal cortex is fried because of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and also because of dopamine. So we have to down the dopamine, up the serotonin, and down the cortisol. There are 4 ways to do that.
Okay. Hold that thought, and when we come back, we'll get those 4 ways to dampen dopamine and enhance serotonin.
You're listening to Dr. Robert Lustig. He's professor of pediatrics in the Division of Endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco. He's a member of the university's Institute for Health Policy Studies, and he's author of Fat Chance, Beating the Odds Against Sugar, Processed Food, Obesity and Disease. His latest book is The Hacking of the American Mind, the science behind the corporate takeover of our bodies and brains. Dr. Lustig consults for several childhood obesity advocacy groups and government agencies.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, you'll learn how you can dampen dopamine and increase serotonin.
What are the 4 C's that can help with this effort?
Could boredom actually be good for youngsters?
Learn about the science behind the corporate takeover of our minds.
How can we resist the temptation posed by processed foods like potato chips or cookies?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. To purchase a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1145. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the free podcast from iTunes or from our web store. We invite you to consider writing a review.
Are there strategies that will allow you to overcome corporate manipulation? How can you de-emphasize dopamine, the neurochemical associated with pleasure and reward? What activities will help you increase serotonin, the neurochemical that boosts contentment and happiness?
Our guest today is Dr. Robert Lustig, professor of pediatrics in the Division of Endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco. He's a member of the university's Institute for Health Policy Studies and author of Fat Chance: Beating the Odds Against Sugar, Processed Food, Obesity, and Disease. His latest book is The Hacking of the American Mind: The Science Behind the Corporate Takeover of Our Bodies and Brains.
Dr. Lustig, what are the 4 ways that we can dampen down the dopamine and increase our measure of serotonin? Are they your 4 C's?
They are. So in the book, I describe them as the 4 C's. Now, they are all things your mother told you. They are all free to everyone on the planet. They are all guaranteed, evidence-based to work or your money back. But again, because they're free, don't expect a refund. They're all things you grew up knowing, but you forgot while you were texting your friend or drinking a Coca-Cola. I call them the 4 C's. The first one, connect. Now, connect does not mean Facebook. Connection is something very specific. It is eye-to-eye, face-to-face, looking at the other person connection. Now, why does it have to be eye-to-eye, face-to-face? The reason is because you have a set of neurons in your occipital lobe, the part of your brain that interprets visual signals. They're called mirror neurons, and you can actually record from them. And what they're doing is they're reading the facial expression of the person that you're talking to in real time. Paul Ekman, famous psychologist from UC Berkeley, went to Papua New Guinea many, many years ago. These people had never seen a white person, yet they had the exact same facial expressions as we do for joy, for happiness, for disgust, for anger, for fear. It's written into our DNA. Everyone on the planet uses the same facial expressions to mean the same internal sets of feelings. Well, when you are with a person and you're reading that in real time and your mirror neurons are interpreting that, it generates serotonin. And this is a process which we have a name for. It's called empathy. And if you can't do it, you are a psychopath. Think about it. That's the definition. You can't generate empathy. Anyway, bottom line, empathy is serotonin. And you have to see the person in order to be able to experience that, to be able to do that. So visiting a sick friend in the hospital, going to church. The reason church works is because it's a meeting place. There are 4,200 religions on the planet, but they all share one thing in common. Doesn't matter what religion you're talking about, they have a meeting place. Every religion has a meeting place.
And they bring people together.
And they bring people together, and that is where you up your serotonin, through community, through connection, not through connectivity. Mark Zuckerberg will tell you, oh, Facebook provides connection. No, it provides connectivity. But you can't have a conversation with Anonymous. In fact, the data on Facebook actually shows the more you use Facebook, the more depressed you become. And of course, the higher your dopamine goes, which is not good. So that's number one. Number two, contribute. Now, contribute does not mean to your IRA. Contribute means outside of yourself. So lottery winners are not happy. Okay? You have to actually contribute to something bigger than yourself. That can be in the terms of volunteerism or altruism or philanthropy. You can pay someone else to do it for you. Or it can be yourself in terms of things you do to better the world. Now, everyone always asks me, does work count? Can you derive contribution through work? And the answer is yes, you can, with two provisos. Number one, you can see how your work helps others. And number two, your boss can see it too. This is how I, get my happiness through contribution. Number three, cope. Now, cope means three specific things: sleep, mindfulness, and exercise. Now, sleep. Turns out you need 8 hours of sleep. 35% of adults in America get less than 7 hours, and 23% get less than 5.5 hours and are clinical insomniacs. When you don't get sleep, you don't generate serotonin. And what happens is, because of ghrelin, which is a hunger hormone, you up the ghrelin, you end up consuming, for the most part, sugared stuff, and you end up upping your dopamine. So sleep deprivation is not good for you. Next, mindfulness. The most dangerous word in the English language of the 21st century is multitasking. You have to multitask in order to get a job today, except for one thing. Only 2.5% of the population can actually multitask. Everyone else is serially unitasking. And every time they switch from one task to another, number one, it takes them 20 minutes to be able to actually focus. And number two, they get a cortisol bump, which is frying their prefrontal cortex and making them very miserable. And number three is exercise. Turns out exercise is as good as SSRIs at alleviating depression. And if you combine mindfulness and exercise, you can actually reverse depression, clinical depression, with no medicine. Been shown, evidence-based. And finally, number four, the fourth C, cook. There are 3 items in food that matter in terms of these 2 neurotransmitters. The first one is tryptophan. Tryptophan is the rarest amino acid in our diet. It's found in eggs, poultry, fish, not exactly processed food. So tryptophan gets converted to serotonin, but only 1% of the tryptophan you consume actually makes it to the brain and gets converted to serotonin. So you got to eat a lot of tryptophan to get it there, and it's the rarest thing in the first place, and it's not in processed food. Number 2, omega-3 fatty acids. Now, omega-3s are the single best thing you can put in your body. Heart-healthy, anti-inflammatory, anti-Alzheimer's. If you look at omega-3 deficient rats, they have an inflammatory haze around their serotonin neurotransmitter synapses in their brain, which goes away when you give the omega-3s back. So they're preventing serotonin neurotransmission because of the omega-3 deficiency. So you need omega-3s to prevent the inflammation. And then finally, fructose, sweet molecule in sugar, which lowers your serotonin. So what you need is a high tryptophan, high omega-3, low fructose diet. That's called real food. But what we have in this country is a low tryptophan, low omega-3, high fructose diet. That's called processed food.
Dr. Lustig, my mother was an incredible behavioral psychologist. Although, she really was a teacher by profession. She didn't have a psychology degree, but she would read to me and the neighborhood kids. And so everybody would gather in our living room, and she would hold us spellbound for an hour or two, or sometimes longer, reading fascinating stories, often with a social context. And if I didn't behave well, the threat was always, you won't get a bedtime story, which was enough to pretty much get me back in line, because those stories were magical. She could read like no one else. And I'm just wondering if she was manipulating my dopamine and serotonin levels, and whether or not this was a good thing or a bad thing.
Oh, it was a great thing. I wish we could had more kids that, wanted bedtime stories instead of Netflix. The fact of the matter is, kids need boredom. You know why they need boredom?
Why?
Because from boredom comes creativity. From the doing nothing, you get serotonin, because that's putting your mind at rest. And that's what serotonin does. That's the contentment. The fact is, we are bombarding our kids with iPads at age 15 months. They're coming into my clinic. The mother gives the kid the iPad just to shut the kid up. What do you think that's doing? We actually have the data. It's ruining kids' brains. It's reducing the rate of myelinization of that prefrontal cortex. It is actually causing neurological damage. Kids need boredom. They need creativity. They need imagination. And we're losing it.
Dr. Lustig, the title of your book, again, is The Hacking of the American Mind, and the subtitle, The Science Behind the Corporate Takeover of Our Bodies and Our Brains. And you've given us tools, the 4 C's, but corporate America is really smart. And
yes,
we've got the commercials, we've got the fast food restaurants, of course, and every time we fill up our car with gasoline, there's the opportunity to buy soft drinks and candy and cookies and all kinds of processed foods. How do we resist that siren call? Because our brains have been hacked.
Indeed, they have. And you're right. It is a siren call. Ultimately, if you're addicted, it's pretty hard to avoid the siren call, isn't it? All right? You know, in the same way you wouldn't let an alcoholic work in a bar. Okay? I mean, the same thing for, processed food. The fact of the matter is, so many of us have succumbed. So many of us are in this state now. What we ultimately have to do is we have to change the food business model so that the food industry, and I'm not against the food industry per se. Ultimately, we need the food industry. I'm not sure we need the tobacco industry, but we need the food industry because we got to eat. The question is, what do we got to eat? Right now, the food industry is rewarded for doing the cheapest thing possible. They're called subsidies. They are actually rewarded for giving us crap. Corn, wheat, soy, sugar. That's what's subsidized, and that's what's killing us. Why couldn't they subsidize real food? Why couldn't they subsidize broccoli or radishes or carrots? Why don't they tax the processed food and use the money from the tax to subsidize the real food? In fact, that's called differential subsidization, and it's actually been done, not for food, but for alcohol, in the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, 1977. Huge alcohol problem, and it was affecting both sides of the ledger. It was affecting the positive side of the ledger in terms of economic productivity because people were calling in on their benders on Monday morning. And it was affecting the negative side of the ledger in terms of cirrhosis of the liver and car accidents. So the 3 Nordic countries in 1977 banded together and they passed 2 pieces of legislation. The first, they nationalized all the liquor stores so that every liquor store in all 3 countries sold the exact same fare at the exact same price. So you couldn't go someplace else and buy it cheaper. Second thing they did was they taxed high alcohol spirits, and they used the money from that tax to subsidize low alcohol beer. So zero-sum game for the government. They didn't make any money on this. But what they did was they provided both the incentive and the punishment at the same time, the carrot and the stick at the same time. And what they were able to do is they were able to nudge people toward the healthier, low-alcohol beer option. And guess what? Economic productivity rose, cirrhosis of the liver and car accidents went down. Over a 20-year period, they finally hit a plateau on both, and those 2 international legislative ordinances are still in place today if you go to Norway, Sweden, or Denmark. Basically, what they did was they moved the entire populace to the healthier alternative. We could do that in the United States if we actually had a politician who cared. The fact of the matter is, we have so many problems in this country right now. We have a healthcare crisis. We have a Social Security crisis. We have an addiction crisis. We have a depression crisis. I would argue that actually those 4 crises are actually just 4 manifestations of the same crisis. The inability to distinguish pleasure from happiness, the inability to understand the difference between dopamine and serotonin and what it does to our brains and our behaviors. And in the process, we are getting fat, sick, stupid, broke, addicted, depressed, and most decidedly unhappy. We can turn it around, but we can't turn it around if everyone is just addicted and depressed. We have to turn it around at a societal level.
Dr. Robert Lustig, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thanks for having me again, Joe and Terry. It's always a pleasure.
You've been listening to Dr. Robert Lustig, Professor of Pediatrics in the Division of Endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco. He's a member of the university's Institute for Health Policy Studies and author of Fat Chance, Beating the Odds Against Sugar, Processed Food, Obesity, and Disease. His latest book is The Hacking of the American Mind, the science behind the corporate takeover of our bodies and brains. Dr. Lustig consults for several childhood obesity advocacy groups and government agencies.
Dr. Lustig's 4 C's include connect, contribute, cope, and cook.
And under cope, he talks about sleep, mindfulness, and exercise. And he pointed out that mindfulness together with exercise may be just as effective or more so than some of our antidepressants, those SSRIs.
He said when it comes to cooking, you need to pay attention to real food because you need more tryptophan and more omega-3 fatty acids in that diet and less fructose, which you find in sugar.
All good advice. Well, that's all the time we have. Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
If you'd like to buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1145. That number, 800-732-2334, or find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, you can share your thoughts about today's show. Have you found ways to overcome the siren song of pleasure offered by big corporations? Have you done it? Please share your story in the comment section of today's show.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter or subscribe to the free podcast of the show. When you sign up for the newsletter, you'll get our free e-guide to favorite home remedies.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.